Hello everyone, my name is Ashish and welcome to the X-Admin channel. So today in this session we are going to discuss the more question on a Spring Boot interview question series. So in our last session or in our first part, we have discussed a few questions like what is a Spring Boot, why should we use a Spring Boot framework, and what are the advantages of a Spring Boot, and what are the goals of a Spring Boot. So these are the theory based but important questions which you may get in the starting of your interview. So I will suggest you to watch this lecture if you have not watched yet. So let's start our second part. And in this, we are going to discuss the next important question, that is the difference between the Spring Framework, Spring Boot, and Spring MVC. So this is the single most important question which will like define that how much knowledge you have regarding these topics. So it will cover all these three important modules of a Spring in a single question. So this is the one of the favorite and the important questions of the interviewer, because with this he can judge that how much knowledge you have regarding these three topics in a very single question he can judge. So today we will see the difference between the Spring Framework, Spring Boot, and Spring MVC. So first of all, I'm going to discuss the some like something about all this topic, right? So first we will see the Spring Framework. So basically a Spring is an open source lightweight framework that allows Java developer to build a simple and a reliable and a scalable enterprise application. So with the Spring framework, it made the development of a web application much easier than compared to the classic Java framework and the APIs interfaces, that is APIs, right? Such as the JDBC and the JSP, that is the Java server pages, and also the Java servlet. So in compare to the JDBC and the JSP and the Java servlet, we can build web application much easier with the help of a Spring framework. So the framework uses various new technique such as AOP, that is accept oriented programming, and it also uses POJO, that is plain old Java object, and also uses DI concept, that is the dependency injection concept, to develop the enterprise application. So basically, the Spring framework can be considered as a collection of the sub framework, also called as the layers such as Spring AOP, Spring ORM, Spring Waveflow, Spring Wave MVC. So this is considered as a collection of a sub like so Spring framework is a collection of the frameworks in which we have the frameworks like AOP and the ORM, Spring Waveflow, Spring Wave MVC, Spring JDVC, Spring Transactions, and all, etc. So you can use any of these modules separately while constructing a web application, or you can use in a group of these modules to provide the better functionality in a web application. So basically, the Spring framework provide the means we can use these modules like individually in a web application to build a web application, or we can use this in a group. We can use this all this module in a single application also. So this is about a Spring framework. So Spring Boot is built on the top of a conventional Spring framework, so it provides all the features of a Spring and yet easier to use than a Spring. So Spring Boot is a microservice based framework. It is also used to build a REST API. And Spring Boot makes the production ready application in a very lesser time. So with the help of a Spring Boot, we can build our production based web application in a lesser time than a Spring framework. So in Spring Boot, everything is auto configured. We just need to use a proper configuration for utilizing a particular functionality. So Spring Boot is a very useful if we want to develop a REST API. So Spring Boot is a way we can build the web application in a much faster than a Spring framework. And a Spring Boot is auto configured, right? With a Spring Boot, we can build a REST API. Also, we can build a microservice based web application in a much faster way. Now, let's see about a Spring MVC. So Spring MVC is a part of a Spring framework that helps for handling the HTTP request and a response. So if a client send a request, then all these are handled by a Spring MVC. And then it processes the request and then it sends the response to the client. So all these are done by a Spring MVC. Spring MVC means M is model, right? And C means like controller, and V means view. So model, view, and controller. So Spring MVC allows you to easily build fully functional Java web application with the help of a kit ready-made components. So the community of the documentation of a Spring MVC is much better than the Spring Boot. So Spring MVC is also used to build a web application. It handles the request coming from the client, it processes the request, and then it provides the response to the client. So all these things are done by the Spring MVC, right? So now we are going to see the difference between all these three, like one by one. So first we will see Spring Framework versus Spring Boot. So a Spring Framework is used for building application using a Java EE framework. So Spring Framework is used to build a web application with the help of Java EE framework. The Spring Boot framework is used to build or to develop a REST API, or also you can develop the microservice based web application with the help of a Spring Boot. So the second point is that Spring Framework is simplify Java EE development that makes a developer to develop the application with ease. So with the help of a Spring Framework, we can easily build the web application. And with a Spring Boot, it decreases the code length and provide the easiest way to develop the web application. So with the Spring Boot, we can reduce the point code. Also, it decreases the code length and it also provides the easiest way to develop the web application. So the third difference is that the main feature of a Spring framework is TI, that is a dependency injection. But the main feature of a Spring Boot is auto configuration. It automatically configure the classes based on the requirement. So the main feature of a Spring framework is dependency injection. So so here the dependency injection is nothing but a technique by which the wave container creates the object of a class. So as a developer, I don't require to create the object of a bean or a class or a service class, right? So wave container do for us. Only we need to mark that class with a auto wire annotation, and the wave container is going to do for us when the web application starts up or boots up. It finds for a auto wire annotation and then it creates the object and keep it with it. And now as a developer, I only need to ask for that reference variable or the object of that class so that we can use that object to call that particular class, right? So this is the third difference between the Spring Framework and the Spring Boot. Now the fourth point is that Spring Framework allows us to develop a loosely coupled application, because here Spring Framework has a different modules as we have discussed already, like AOP and the JDBC, Spring JDBC, Spring Transitions, Spring Waveflow. So all these modules can be configured or developed in a loosely coupled manner. But in Spring Boot, it helps to create a standalone application with a minimal configuration. So with a Spring Boot, we can develop a standalone application with a very few like configuration or a very like minimum configuration. So this is the fourth difference between a Spring framework and a Spring Boot. Now let's see some more differences. In a Spring framework, the developer have to write a lot of code, that is the boilerplate code, to do the minimal task. But in a Spring Boot, it reduces the boilerplate code, right? In a Spring framework, we have to set up a server explicitly. So in a Spring, we have to set up a server explicitly. Let's say that I have developed some application with the help of a Spring framework. Then I need to deploy that web application into a external server or a split server so that we can run that web application. But this is not with a Spring Boot, as a Spring Boot have embedded servers like Jetty, Tomcat, and the Undertow. So with this, we can deploy that web application built by a Spring Boot in its embedded server itself. Although we can deploy the Spring Boot web application into the external servers also, but for a testing purpose we don't need to deploy to the external servers because it has its internal or the embedded servers like JT, Tomcat, right? So the another point of a Spring framework is that it required to define a manually all the dependencies which are required in a Spring based project in a pom.xml. So we need to define all the dependencies in a pom.xml if we are using a Spring framework. So the main feature of a Spring Boot is auto configuration. It automatically configures the classes based on the requirement, right? Now, the next point is that it allows us to develop a loosely coupled application, and Spring Boot has a, has a starter in pom.xml file that internally takes care the downloading the dependencies jar based on the Spring Boot requirement. So we can do the configuration in very easy way, right? So these are the some points for the differences between the Spring framework and the Spring Boot. Now we are going to see the next question, that is the difference between a Spring Boot and a Spring MVC. So Spring Boot is a module of a Spring framework. So Spring MVC defines a model view controller based web application, right? So with a Spring Boot, we can build a Spring powered application with a minimal configuration. But with a Spring MVC, we have to import the required libraries in our project. So if we are using Spring MVC, then we have to use the import statement for importing the required libraries in our project. So with a Spring Boot, the auto configuration is done. But if we are using the Spring MVC, then it required to build configuration like manually. Basically, if we are using a Spring MVC, then manually we have to configure all the configurations. But this is not true with the Spring Boot. It comes with the auto configuration. In a Spring Boot, it avoids boilerplate code and wraps the dependencies together in a single unit. So in a Spring Boot, we can avoid the boilerplate code and it wraps dependencies together in a single unit. So all the dependencies are wrapped up in a single unit. But in a Spring MVC, the dependencies are separated and the libraries are separated. In Spring Boot, it reduces the development time and increases the productivity time. But with a Spring MVC, it requires more time to develop the application because the configuration is very hard, and always we have to use the import statement to import any libraries or the third party libraries. But in Spring Boot, it reduces the development time and increases the productivity of a web application. So these are the some points, the difference between the Spring Boot and the Spring MVC, and also we have discussed the points for a Spring Framework and a Spring Boot. So basically, in the next lecture or the session, we are going to see in a depth manner the architecture of a Spring Boot. So this is also important question which you may get, that explain the architecture of a Spring Boot. So in the next session or the lecture, we will see deeply the layers of a Spring Boot, right? So thank you and have a nice day. See you in the next lecture.